Welcome to Full Circle, the Leapfrog series. I'm your host, Edward Greenspon, and I am quite excited today to be talking with two very prominent people in the world of energy at a very key moment in Canada's quest to increase our prosperity and strengthen our sovereignty. On June 30th, as we all prepare to celebrate our 158th birthday, economic history was being made in the northwest corner of the country. A ship called the Gaslog Glasgow slipped out of harbor in Kitimat, British Columbia, escorted through the Douglas Channel by a pair of battery-powered tugboats jointly owned, and I note, by the Haisla Nation. The ship carried the first cargo of Canadian liquefied natural gas ever to leave the continent. Until June 30th, Canada could only export our abundant gas supplies over the border to the United States. We were captive suppliers, and we paid a price, quite literally, because we didn't have very many options of who to sell to. Now, with the completion of the $40 billion LNG Canada facility, we have joined the global market. We are a global player, not a continental player alone. In many ways, the timing couldn't be better. Just as Canada is looking to diversify our exports beyond a less dependable United States, along comes LNG. Then again, it's taken a long time to get to this point. The US and Canada began kicking the tires on LNG about 20 years ago, but their first shipment left port nearly a decade ago, and ours just last month. Our two guests today have lived and breathed all this. Susannah Pierce, former president and country chairperson at Shell Canada, which is the operating partner of LNG Canada, and Andrew Swart, managing partner, energy resources and industrials at Deloitte Canada. Now, as regular listeners know, we have at this critical time for Canada turned Deloitte's Full Circle podcast over to what we are calling the Leapfrog series. The idea is to explore how we can actually turn Canada's considerable geopolitical stresses and strains into a new era of greater competitiveness, sovereignty, and prosperity. To leapfrog, in other words. And LNG, it has a lot of bounce. So let's get at it. Welcome to the podcast, Susannah and Andrew.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's great to be here.
Likewise, I'm super excited about the conversation.
Well, great to have you both here. Susannah, I want to start with you, and I want to go, you've lived LNG for a long time, and June 30th, I imagine, must have been a very special moment in this journey. So maybe just talk to me a little bit about what that day, watching a ship leave Kitimat, eventually arrive in Korea, what that meant to you.
Well, thank you for the remembrance and honoring the day. Listen, that day was a culmination of so many people's efforts, and I was one person in that effort. And so when that day came, and as the ship was leaving, and seeing the pictures and the photos, and seeing all of the commentary, I think it was a day of deep thought, remembrance, some pride in there too for the people in Kitimat that actually were there as the ship sailed away, and as they saw safely it was carrying the first significant cargo overseas. To this day, when I run into people, to think about, oh yes, I remember when. And I thought about how many premiers, there were in BC. Of course, you had Christy Clark, then you had John Horgan, now you have Premier Eby. You think about how many mayors. We actually had two different mayors in Kitimat and now Phil Germuth. You had, how many CEOs of LNG Canada at the time? At least 4. You just know how much time and effort it went into seeing that actually happened. And I still have a smile on my face by thinking about it.
Where were you? Were you home in Vancouver?
I was actually in Vancouver, because I was not on the project, and because Shell, it is a Shell operated venture, doesn't mean that I am part of the LNG Canada project anymore. In fact, it has its own CEO, it has its own leadership team, and so I was not actually even there as the cargo sailed away.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you say that, I can recall I was the global managing editor for energy for Bloomberg when the first shipment left Louisiana, left Cheniere, and that could have been ours. Could have been and should have been ours. But interestingly, and I was struck by this, Susannah, on that day, on June 30th, we heard everyone, the mayor of Kitimat, the chief counselor of the Haisla Nation, Premier Eby, Prime Minister Carney, praise this project. United, this was an important development. Where the heck did all this political consensus come from suddenly?
Isn't that amazing? In the development of this industry and this project. And something I think is worth noting, that gave the United States a bit of a head start is the United States already has a lot of pipelines. They actually already were importing natural gas. And then, of course, shale gas came around, and then they realized they have more gas than they need. They can start exporting out of those import terminals. And they already had pipelines connecting, the basins all the way down to the coastlines. We in Canada didn't really have that. We had to connect basins in the northeast part of BC and Alberta all the way through to the western coast. So we had to build infrastructure. We had to build ports, whereas I think the United States had a bit of a head start just from that perspective. But indeed, when I joined the LNG Canada project back in 2013, it was still just the development of a project amongst others. And of course, Christy Clark was very bullish at the time for LNG and had a list of projects that were trying to figure out whether or not they could pass a final investment decision. But it was still early days. It was still a work and an effort to prove that, this industry could be competitive. You could build it, greenfield, brownfield. You could actually get a pipeline constructed across the Rockies and the coastal mountains at cost that could be competitive as you shipped gas. So we were still very much in the development phase. We still had to help people understand what is liquefied natural gas. What do you mean you chill it and then it forms a gas? And what do you mean you can put it on carriers? This is a new concept for British Columbia and Canada. And so part of it was helping to tell the story. It was also telling the story, as I mentioned, across all the various different communities and Indigenous groups, all the way from where you would bring the gas through to the coast. It was new. One of the advantages, I would say, over time was the fact that liquefied natural gas, especially if you would carry it over water, was not like oil. And that meant that there were lots of memories or images of an oil spill, very less so of an LNG spill because it's very rare. And even if LNG were to be spilled, because it's so cold, it evaporates, at temperatures, that are normal. So for us, it was a little bit of a different conversation from a safety and environmental impact perspective, but there's still quite a lot of work to do to help people understand why should I take the time and the effort to understand this. And one of the other things that I think was an advantage, at least to the LNG Canada project, which was, I think, one of the other reasons why we were successful, was not just, about the relationships that we developed on the ground within each of the communities, which is absolutely table stakes and crucial. We front-end loaded that, which is wise in my view, not just the technical design, but also the work with communities and First Nations and Indigenous groups. But it was also the fact that you had the producers of the gas who would then become the shippers along the pipeline, who would then become essentially the entities which would then produce the LNG at LNG Canada. They were each of the 5 joint venture participants. And then they would market the gas. So you had an end-to-end value chain where you didn't have to go figure out, well, who's going to sell my gas? Well, guess what? We are. Well, who can consume? Some of our partners at the time were also consumers of this gas. So you actually were able to bolt end to end the entire value chain, which I think reduced risk and also helped to understand the full risk cost profile and competitive profile of the entire venture, which again was another reason why I think that particular project was successful when others weren't.
Just stick with the First Nations there for a moment. I know along the Coastal GasLink there were about 20, but I want to focus particularly on the Haisla. They've run with this. They're going to be the owner of their own LNG facility in short order. Was that the way it was at the beginning?
No, of course not. It wasn't. And in fact, the better person to tell the story is probably Ellis Ross, who was the chief elected councillor. And he would, if he were here, he would laugh and say, we told him to get out of here. And we were not the only project in town. Chevron had a project at the time of the channel. But it took a lot of sitting together, understanding shared interests. I call it shared value. How do you actually look at how we can build something together that meets the individual interests of all parties together, First Nations? How can you build trust? One of the things that sometimes, when you're far away from projects, you forget is that there's a lot of communities on the ground that don't have trust for big industry because they have been bypassed or in some cases have been ignored or have not been participants or don't even know who the people are who are building in their backyard. So part of it was building the relationships. And a common expression we used at the time was building relationships before we built the project. And so, people like Andy Calitz at the time, who was CEO, was fantastic at this sort of thing. And the entire project worked in that kind of an environment where there was an expectation that we worked together with all stakeholders and First Nations so that we could understand where we found areas of mutual agreement, where we found areas that we couldn't, where we might have to deviate from the original design to recognize that this is an area that you cannot go. Whether we look at how do we raise various different pieces of infrastructure to avoid various, places where there were trap lines or any kind of historical importance. Lots of different things that we took in very early on, so that when we were developing it and even going through regulatory and environmental process, this is key, it was not combative. It was inclusive and collaborative. And we used traditional knowledge as part of that as well. So we developed a very close relationship with the community. And you were there on the ground. And that's one of the reasons I moved to British Columbia, because I felt that if you're going to build in British Columbia, you should be in British Columbia. I used to have this joke, and you'll get this, Ed, having worked in a newspaper, that when you woke up in Vancouver and you read the newspaper, you heard about how horrible the oil and gas industry was. Whereas when you woke up in Calgary and you read the newspaper, you heard how misunderstood the oil and gas industry was. Why don't people understand us? So it was really important for me.
What was it like when you woke up in Kitimat?
In Kitimat, it was still a little bit of, what's this all about? And but Kitimat was also a fantastic community to work with, and I really, really enjoyed the time that I could spend there with the community. It still continues to be a very special place in my heart, and I don't get to go there as much anymore. But Kitimatans were fantastic.
Andrew, I want both of you to take a shot at this. I'll start with you, Andrew. As we're now moving into a period of national interest projects, that is the policy of the Government of Canada, Bill C5, to move forward there, what are the lessons that you think we can draw off LNG Canada that will be applicable, that, will help move things along moving forward?
Yeah, so I'll cut into this in a few ways. I think one is, I'll almost just go back to the question you earlier asked, Susannah, around why at this moment in time, June 30th, you sort of see a lot of the political will coming together, right? And I think one of the key reasons for that is that there's been a real shift in the dialogue over the last sort of couple of years. And so, in terms of, like net zero targets that the country has kind of committed to, the reality has also set in over the last few years that you're dealing with this issue of energy security, you're dealing with energy affordability, and now most recently sovereignty, right? And so I think there's nothing like a crisis that begins to coalesce people around this. And so there is a certain moment in time that we're at right now, which begins to define what that energy infrastructure going forward actually begins to look like. And I think this gets to the heart of your sort of second question, right, which is around what do we take away from that LNG project? And I think for me there are a few things that stand out. I think one is, as Susannah's sort of spoken about, the participation of Indigenous communities and First Nations in those projects. And it's not just about consultation. I think we've moved into an era of like real participation, real partnership, right? And I think that begins to create a framework, a blueprint of what that might look like going forward, not just for energy projects, but for resource projects sort of overall. The second key thing that I would just say is that it goes back to my sort of intro here around being able to sort of coalesce around a particular idea. And I think it's really important for any of these projects which span like, decades, right? And that actually transcend, political governments and political terms. And I think it's really important to get that alignment across the aisle on the importance for these particular projects and how they play into things like energy security, energy sovereignty, energy affordability, right? And so I think it's that sort of coalescing that we sort of need around these big projects going forward.
So some of those points I want to come back to in a moment: energy security, our role in the world, et cetera. But as I turn to you on this question, Susannah, I want you to build on a little bit what you said in a number of speeches in recent times. You've quoted Tip O'Neill saying all politics is local, and I guess all projects are local too, are they?
Yeah, and it's true. It's a principle that somehow over time I've been involved in a number of big projects, and I've always felt that building relationships on the ground, understanding those interests is absolutely crucial, because we can try to build it remotely, but then typically projects have been hung up because of local concerns and local interests. So for me, and I think it's just a principle by which every project linear or non-linear needs to abide by is understanding community interest.
Well, just for people who don't know, you were involved with the Keystone XL project.
The Keystone project, not the XL one, the
okay,
one that
first
got
Keystone,
built.
The original, the one that got built. Okay. And did you learn that lesson then?
I learned that lesson then, but I also learned that lesson before on some LNG projects that were for import. And this was way back when I was actually with TC Energy, which was TransCanada Pipelines at the time, and we had been proposing a project with Shell called Broadwater, which was to import LNG into New York, right into the middle of Long Island Sound. But there was a lot of front-end community work there that I really, I think, cut my teeth on and really learned a lot about the necessity of getting local stakeholder buy-in, which then gets to the next layer, which gets more to the state level, which then gets to the federal level. Like in that project called Broadwater LNG, I mean, you're dealing with, senators at the time, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton. You're dealing with governors in New York. You're dealing with Mayor Bloomberg at the time. Like this was a hotbed of media. Like where else is you have like global media focus? So I learned a lot then. I also learned a lot, strangely enough, when I was in graduate school, and I worked on a sabbatical down in Santiago, Chile, and I actually did some engagement on the Gas Andes pipeline, which was to bring gas from Argentina into Chile so that it could actually begin to feed the first combined cycle gas plant. But that's a long story long ago. I learned that people want to be able to understand why you're there, and they want to be able to know that whatever you're trying to build is in their interest. And that rolls all the way up to the top. Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House, said all politics is local. Project development needs to be grounded in local issues, concerns, and opportunities. And then also you can go back to people like Michael Porter, who wrote about shared value, the concept around, I might be quoting this wrong, but companies will profit if communities prosper, essentially, which is to say that when you create relationships where you can demonstrate that it's shared interests, you then have the grounding by which you can then build up and build further relationships. And that really worked on the LNG Canada project. And so that was a level of effort that we had. And we were also willing to be held accountable for it, and propose, well, this is how we will continue to monitor and share concerns within communities so that all levels of government can understand that. So yeah, it was absolutely crucial. And to this day, I don't think there's any project that can ever be successful if they don't start with it, if they don't continue it over the life of any project, including when the project may shut down. This is also another really hard thing because we've seen in many communities when projects and industries disappear, we can't forget that either because you've built communities around that. And that's also something that really you need to be mindful about as you look at project development.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I was just going to pick up on that, which is I think one of the important things to think about as we think about like big projects getting implemented in the country is our ability to be able to catalyze economic growth beyond the project itself, right? And as you've said, it's like you're putting in infrastructure which is going to span multiple generations, and like resource projects, a lot of them like ultimately come to an end, right? The resource runs out, and then you need to move on, and so. But when you move on, you decimate those communities. And so you have this opportunity when you put these projects in to be thinking beyond the life of the project, right? If you're putting in a power line or you're putting in rail or those sorts of things, and maybe it's geared towards supporting energy or it's geared towards supporting mining or whatever the case may be. But how could you use that infrastructure longer term to also be thinking about things like manufacturing, agriculture, etc.? And so it's sort of a catalyst for broader economic growth, right? And you refer to Michael Porter, and my sort of previous firm was owned by Michael Porter, and so I'm very well schooled in that sort of thinking. But
I was going to say when you said, I hope I'm saying this right, I was going to say Andrew can tell us.
No, but at the heart of it is you're beginning to talk about cluster theory, right? And how are you creating these broader clusters of economic activity, right? Which might have an anchor tenant in the form of a major LNG project or a major resource project or whatever the case may be. But its ability to be able to catalyze broader growth is key, right?
Yeah, and you know what, you're bringing me to the concept around 7 generations, right? And so again, that is something that we need to be very forward thinking on, I think. But I even just witnessed it when we were looking at construction into actual operations of a facility, or even looking at a certain skilled labor moving into a different level of skilled labor. Well, what happened to the front, development opportunity? Like so basically the less skilled labor, when that job was done, where did they go? So we really have to be thoughtful about these things. And part of, I think, a community, any kind of sponsor of a project, and this is what we did as well, is you need to look across the entire development of the project over time and make sure that you're being mindful, working with governments, of how to make sure that this is a sustainable opportunity for all.
Well, I wonder at the particular moment we find ourselves in time, and I think there's two aspects to this I want to probe, because I believe, you've alluded in some other comments about the need to be, if I could use the word, inclusive about these projects, not just with the communities in there, but Canada is being called upon by its allies in the world. Canada needs to diversify. But one of the points you made that I found quite interesting is, we have a weak economy and we have stagnant incomes, and we have a lot of young people who feel in an affordability crisis and feel left out by the economy. How do we connect this to them and their anxieties and their aspirations?
Yeah, this is a really hard challenge for us, I think, and I think we can look at it from the perspective that you need governments really working together on this challenge. So part of it is recognizing, I think, in Canada that resource revenues can actually help deliver some of the indirect jobs that are associated with resource development, but they can also help to fund future opportunities in future industries where we might have a comparative advantage, where we might be able, with the right fiscal policy and the right industrial policy and economic policy, start to build new opportunities and new jobs. But all of it has to work together. And this is, I think, the challenge that we've got. Resource revenue in and of itself is great. Royalties, tax revenues, fantastic. Good for the industry, good for those associated with the industry directly and indirectly. But what else can it help us do? What are some of those tangential industries that can develop alongside of it? Look at technology. Sometimes I felt like a lot of the energy industry are really technology companies because we're constantly looking at new tech. Look at the application of artificial intelligence as well. That's another opportunity for us to actually demonstrate how AI can be applied to the industry, but then also can be applied to other industries. We can incubate associated with the primary industry to grow new ones. But that takes a lot of forward thinking. It takes a lot of planning. It's not something that we're used to, especially in the cycles that we face here where we have people getting elected every 2 to 4 years. So it's a problem, but it does require we start to think longer term. It does require that we start to really get our hands on our deficit spending and our debt. We do need to look at what programs are truly necessary. How are we incentivizing the right investments through those programs? How are we matching public dollars with private dollars, driving investment into Canada? We really have to have a hard look at that. We really have to have a hard look at all of the extra spending and whether or not we can make some cuts to really focus on investment that can help generate longer-term prosperity.
Well, I want to focus on investment over the next couple of minutes in that way, because obviously if we're going to develop projects, if we're going to develop national interest projects, we need people who want to put their money into Canada. How are we going to do that? How are we going to persuade them that Canada is a good destination now?
I think first and foremost, it's around regulatory uncertainty, or providing certainty and removing the uncertainty, right? And so I think, again, because these are multi-decade type projects and you are sinking in huge amounts of capital, I think what investors look for is that certainty that's going to span multiple governments, right? So I think that's one key thing. But then I think you begin to look at the enabling factors that go into these projects. Talent, like we just touched on talent. And the industry, and I think as a country we have to be able to tell that energy story which ignites the possibilities in amongst the youth to choose this as an industry that they want to work in, right? And so you need to be able to develop those kinds of talent models and skills in those particular regions. I think along with that, though, it's not just the physical bodies, right? But I think it's also what's the skill set that you're going to be looking for, and how's that going to change over time. We are, constrained from a talent perspective right now within many parts of the industry. And so I think we have to think creatively. We've got to think creatively about how you skill people up. And is it the traditional educational models, or do you need to be looking at things like, micro skilling as an example, as a different mechanism? So anyway, I mean, I think there's something around regulatory certainty. There's probably something around talent would be two key levers that I would be thinking about.
And that's just in the natural resources industry, which I 100% agree with. Regulatory certainty has been crucial, and the complexity of multiple layers of regulatory policy, whether it's federal and then provincial, and then you throw in some more federal, and how am I supposed to figure it? So that is complex, and you're right. The certainty so it stops changing, and what you can actually start to understand your economic model around really makes a lot of sense. But Canada's also been the home of some major fantastic tech companies. You look at Shopify, you look at WhatsApp, but we can look at, what's happening, Sanctuary AI in Vancouver. I'm basically just scraping the top of this. We know that we have the ability, especially right now, to develop some pretty global, fantastic companies. We need to learn from those companies what worked, what needs to change. I think there's tax policy. I think there's R&D policy. In addition to the regulatory policy just focused on the natural resources sector, I think we need to take a broader view because on the one hand, we are a natural resource-based economy today. But just as we had in this conversation already, that will be for the next 4 or 5 decades, maybe longer. But what happens next? We need to start incubating and building the enterprises, the services companies of tomorrow, today. We need to be forward thinking. We need to think about the revenues we're generating now to invest in while continuing to make sure the competitive conditions are right for those investments. So it's recycling, essentially. But it also means we need to get our fiscal house in order. We need to run our country almost as sharp as we would run, candidly, a company. We need to understand our balance sheet. What revenues are we generating and what are we spending? We continue to generate less revenues but spend more. We need to look at revenue generation, which is why I think in part you now have a government saying, let's generate some revenues because we can't afford this anymore. So that's good because it hasn't always been, let's look at the revenue generation side. Today we are, and that's been crucial. I think that's a crucial change in the dialogue.
I think you elicit from me the need to do a commercial message on Deloitte's Future of Canada Centre, because we will have coming out in the fall a report, which is tentatively called Winning Globally. And Winning Globally talks to a bunch of companies as well, and some of them are traditional multinationals, and some of them are only interested in North America. But there's a whole cohort of companies of the sort that you described that are kind of native global. They're global in their head to start with. And I think those are the ones we've got to nurture, right? And I don't know what nurturing means. It might be getting out of their way. It might be helping them. That's a policy question. But it's an interesting shift, I think, of mindset from a generation that's just born to think globally.
Well, and I think, again, it comes back down to almost every policy the government's going to be faced with, including immigration policy. Like, it all needs to feed towards today, but also future Canada. How are we creating the competitive conditions to grow Canada into the future? How do we attract the right people? How do we attract the right investments? Because, I'm an optimist for Canada. We've got so many wonderful endowments. We have so much opportunity in front of us. Now it's really about working together to make sure that it happens over time. But we've got a lot of excellence. We've got a lot of experience to suggest it can happen. Nurture, replicate, continue. All on that path is going to be crucial. So I'm going to be listening to your series.
Susannah, if I can just build on what you've said, I mean, one of the ways that I've always sort of thought about this topic of competitiveness is that, the role of government is to put the conditions in place by which companies are going to compete, right? It sets the rules of the game. And so, at the heart of this is like, to your point, like you've got to think about the industries that you want, the vision of what you want over the next couple of years, and how is that playing field that you're creating now, those conditions that you're playing now, going to create the impetus for capital to come into this country and go into these kinds of projects?
Yeah, and I've got to say, sometimes I wonder, because we haven't had a good record on this, and because the reputation of Canada as a destination for investment has diminished over recent years, I wonder if we need some signature attention-grabbing policies in the way that perhaps the Irish did, a generation ago with certain tax changes. And I don't know what those are, but I think, maybe you've lived in a multinational until very recently. are, do you think that we need to track their attention in a very particular way?
100%. And absolutely. And my mind was going to the fact that, investors have a choice, especially multinationals, of where they can put their money, their capital investment. So regulatory certainty is part of that. Regulatory certainty and predictability. Fiscal policies. What does the tax regime look like? How can I make sure that I know that I'm getting a return on my investment compared to other places? All those things matter. So if you look at 5 different industries, I do a comparison with the other countries we're competing with and say, what are they doing? Why are they attracting more investment in their jurisdictions versus me? And then you have some choice. Then you have some ability to say, well, this is why. Can I change this? If I change this, what happens? What happens to other industries? So we have to have that kind of mapping. We need to look at where we have some comparative advantages. I mean, we have a huge country. Natural resources typically have been. But we have other areas where we can have comparative advantages attached to perhaps that natural resources industry. Look at carbon capture sequestration as a technology. I mean, we've been doing that here in Alberta for a long, long time, and we've demonstrated the technology through projects like Quest, which was a Shell facility at the time. So we can build out, I think, new sectors and industries attached to the legacy and the older sectors and industries with focus and attention, and by integrating across all policies, fiscal policy, immigration policy, R&D policy, et cetera, et cetera. We need a plan. We need a vision. We need an integrated strategy.
So let's circle back to LNG Canada and LNG Canada 2. So, for listeners who don't know, there's already approval. There's been approval in place for a long time to double the capacity of this plant, but that's an investment decision that has to be made by the companies who are involved, if I understand that correctly. What will it take? What needs to happen for both the policymakers and the people who are investing the capital to say, okay, we're moving ahead, we're going to double the capacity, we're going to really, turn Canada into big LNG power, and other projects that might follow as well?
Well, I'm going to just preface that by saying I'm not in the LNG Canada project anymore, and I'm not at Shell. But what I would say is that, yes, the project, when we first went through the environmental approvals, we got approvals for both phases, phase 1 and phase 2, which is to double the capacity of the facility. So at this point, knowing how the minds, at least of one company would work in making a final investment decision is they would be looking across the variety of different choices they have in their portfolio, which would be Canada, LNG Canada, which could be other parts of the world, and saying, for this point in time, when this decision needs to be made, are there alternatives for where I could put my capital? And they will measure that against these other alternatives on the basis of, do I have some form of certainty in terms of that return, in terms of its ability to be built on time, in terms of its ability to feed my portfolio when I need it? So those are the decisions I would expect that a company would be making. From a government's perspective, again, I'm not in government, but I would imagine that I would be looking at, well, what is in my interest as a country for this project, this second phase to proceed? And, I remember John Horgan at the time on the provincial level, Premier Horgan would say, you need 4 conditions you need to meet, at least, from the Premier's perspective, is that it has to be jobs for BCers, revenues for BCers, partnership with First Nations and Indigenous groups, and that you are consistent with our environmental policies. Those are the 4 conditions that you had to pass in order for his support. So from a government lens perspective, both at the provincial and the federal level, they probably are looking at, well, what is it that I need to see for this project to proceed? How does this help me return value to Canadians or to BCers? That's the decision making that any policymaker is probably making.
Andrew, what do you think those governments do need to see? And what they need to see that they can get as well?
I would agree with a lot of those conditions that Susannah has sort of mentioned. I mean, I think from any government's going to be first and foremost orientated around, job creation, job growth. And ultimately, that's what wins and loses elections at the ballot box, right? And so, but I also think that this is where governments do need to be thinking over a longer time frame, right? And I think this notion that I mentioned earlier of looking at a project not just in isolation, but its ability to be able to catalyze broader economic development, broader economic growth. And I think that requires foresight. It requires to be able to look at the art of the possible, shall I say, which is beyond, let's say, a project and an industry, and look at what could what that could generate over the next 10, 15 years if you laid in manufacturing, you laid in services, you laid in technology, et cetera, et cetera. And then how does that sort of realize a broader vision for a province or a sub-region, et cetera? So that's sort of how I would be thinking about it, both the short-term opportunity, but then the long-term possibility.
And maybe if I could just jump in, because I think we mentioned in the beginning, but energy security is something which is front of mind of government, and I think we've heard them speak to that very publicly. And that certainly became more important when we started to see that there were risks of tariffs south of the border on Canadian products, including energy. So that I think that was the wake-up call that, hey, we do have really one large customer, and if that one large customer changes their mind about us, or they become self-sufficient, what the United States generally has been over time, then what do we do? What happens next? So that's why there was so much more momentum behind LNG, because it was a project that was just about to export. And oh, great, look, we're already doing it. So I imagine energy security and foreign policy, candidly, in my view, trade policy, has unfortunately played in the subtext when it needs to be playing in bold letters, I think, for Canada. I've been feeling that for a long, long time. And part of that, I think, is, some feedback anecdotally that many of our partners internationally don't know who Canada is and are really looking for Canada to show who they are. And so I think foreign policy, trade policy is absolutely crucial. And I think that has also been brought to the front line as a result of what we've been experiencing.
Yeah, I have a sense that the balance of probabilities has shifted in a lot of ways. So 2 years ago, I think we'd be talking about something that I think should still be a goal, but not necessarily a showstopper, which is electrification of the project. So that would be one of the great advantages. We know that Canada's gas is considerably cleaner than anybody else's gas to start with. But with electrification, it's like a shutout. But I don't think that has the same pressure today that it did a few years ago, does it?
Not to my knowledge and not from my ability to observe it. I mean, what I would say is that there's a demand for clean electrons for every industry, candidly. And, policymakers need to make a choice as to which industry can the electrons, one, be produced for and get to, because transmission matters. So I'm not seeing it as the same push. And you've even seen the Minister Dick's comment on things like that for LNG projects that you can electrify when the electrons are available. So not so much. But again, we know we need clean power, more clean power. At least that is the demand that we're seeing. The challenge is going to be to produce it.
I mean, just to make this real, I guess beyond just sort of LNG, but you look at like the rise of AI data centers as an example, right? So we're seeing a lot of pressure right around the world in the build out of these data and AI centers. That's going to take power. Right? It's going to take a lot of power to build this out. And even if you sort of build in the natural technology efficiencies you're going to get with chip design, the power requirements are going to be significant. And I'd say if you went back, let's say this was 5 years ago, the pressure for those AI data centers to be powered by, clean power would be immense. But right now, the pace at which these things are being built out, people need to leverage the full energy spectrum and all energy sources in order to do that. And so, I mean, that also creates long-term opportunity for Canada, as an example, where you're utilizing, let's say, captive gas sources or stranded gas resources that you can't get to Tidewater, as an example, right? And so I think that there are... I think the environment has sort of changed around that. And for me, AI data centers are just a little bit of a view of what's actually happening in the market right now.
Can I just jump in here, though, too? But I think the policy in Canada still, with the clean electricity regulation, makes it really challenging to look at putting money into natural gas-fired power, as much as that might be the answer, as we're certainly seeing in the United States. Under the CER, I can't imagine anybody putting money for a plant that won't run more than 10 years. So I think we're in a real, this is the sticky position that we're in right now. And nuclear, we know, is great if you're a nuclear energy supporter, but long timelines and very expensive. So, and here's the challenge too on data centers and AI. Most of us don't even know how much power we're demanding with that prompt. We actually need, as consumers, as users, true. We need to actually better understand that. So I would expect our Minister of AI has some ideas on this. But, again, this is sort of the new era of once people have it, we know how much value there is from asking the right prompts and getting information. It blows our minds and how more efficient life can become. but we haven't looked at the full life cycle challenges associated with it. And now we're just coming up against that. So yeah, stay tuned, I think.
I hate to do this to you, but I want to ask one more geeky issue question, the geekiest of all.
Ask it to Andrew.
Interview to get this geeky. You think you point to Andrew for the geeky question. And it's particularly an LNG-related question. There is a contradiction, I guess, I might say in Marxian economic terms. There's some form of contradiction between Canada achieving its Paris targets, which we're not talking about as much anymore, but still exist. And I think Canadians are still committed to the idea of decarbonizing while having a strong economy along the way, and global emissions. So the export of LNG creates this paradox that we might actually bring down emissions in the world, but we will in so doing bring them up in Canada. How are we going to square that circle? Do we have to square that circle?
I mean, my simple answer here, Ed, is that I think at the end of the day, sort of, emissions aren't bound by, particular territorial borders, right? They're a global issue. And so I think the nature of governments and the nature of policies, and I think how the Paris Agreement was structured ultimately, sort of brings us down at a kind of a country level. But this is a global problem, and so I do think that there is a broader dialogue as a country that we need to get comfortable with. That we have the opportunity, if we can get energy to market, in order to make a global impact on this issue. And if we can utilize natural gas in order to wean particular countries off, higher sources of emission fuels, like, we should absolutely be doing that, right? And I think we're at a point now where I think we have to look at this from a global perspective and not just from a country level perspective.
How do we do that, Susannah?
Well, and just jumping on top of what you shared, Andrew, I agree. I think that this is an opportunity. And the Paris Agreement did have Article 6, which I'm sure many of your listeners have heard about, which is the ability to actually trade internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And I looked at those early days when I was with the project. The challenge is actually establishing the agreements between two countries to trade. So you would like to trade with a country that has excess, bill, or has more emissions credits to give back than we have to gather. So carbon markets are a component of that, but they don't just have to be under Paris. I mean, we could start to look at various different trades, under the energy or emissions trading systems with, for example, the EU or other like-to-like countries. The challenge is going to be how you establish those trades. And I even look at it from the Canadian perspective. This is something that frustrated me a little bit when I was looking at Paris, was that we can't even trade emissions or credits across provincial borders. When we talk about removing borders between our provinces, carbon markets are another component of that. Whereas via MIT in British Columbia to support an LNG industry, how come I cannot offset or get a credit in Alberta if I can actually capture a ton and put it in the ground in Alberta based on the fact that we've done CCS for a long time, we have opportunity to do more. So I think we have to really unpack. One, yes, I think we know on the basis that if LNG produced in Canada is shipped over to China or to Korea and can actually back out coal-fired power, I think you can make a very good argument to say that it's lowering emissions. But you have to be able to demonstrate that that's additive. It wouldn't otherwise happen. It gets complex. So I think we just basically have to look at, yes, we know that. It should go forward, but by the same token, we should over time make sure that we're being held accountable for it. And so that we can actually begin to demonstrate over time, yes, we're seeing emissions go down. Yes, we're seeing it's actually having an impact, because otherwise people will probably argue, well, that's just talk.
So establishing, as you say, that it's additive, perhaps not beyond a shadow of doubt, but to a reasonable, like a reasonableness test as opposed to a shadow of doubt test, probably makes good sense. We do flirt with the potential perversity that Japan, Korea, Germany, countries that want our gas for energy security reasons, for reasons I've heard from Ukrainians in way, if you could sell more gas to Japan and Korea, they would buy less from Russia, and Russia would have less money to finance its war machine against us. The world is connected in strange ways. Can you imagine Canada just doing that unilaterally, or exporting, in concert with other exporting nations?
Exporting more gas just so that we could actually back out Russian, or?
Well, no, counting sort of saying on our national totals.
That's potentially another way of looking at it, that this is the amount of gas or energy that's being produced specifically for export. So we're going to account for it differently. Yeah, I've heard some conversations around that. Yes, you can look at that. And then therefore our NDCs are just going to be that which we use for domestic consumption. That would be a way of separating it and then looking at that differently. You could start to parse it out that way.
Okay, so let me end on this. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you when it comes to a resource like LNG, or quite frankly, other of Canada's resources, that we will have the vision, the optimism, the courage, the tenacity, the cleverness to actually be a leapfrog nation, to really change in light of the...
I'm probably going to put it at around somewhere between a 7 and an 8, probably. So I think by nature I'm an optimist, and I do believe that I think we're in a particular moment in time where I think you've got a lot of political will. I think you've got a lot of will across different political parties. I think as a country we've begun to galvanize around some of these sort of key issues, and I think people are recognizing the importance of energy. But I think we'll have to see how the dialogue plays out over the next couple of months. But to me, I think you have to be an optimist in this sort of situation. And I think being able to see and articulate what the possibility is and what needs to be done to get there, I think that's the sort of dialogue that we need, and how you begin to galvanize and energize people. No pun intended.
It's a difficult question to answer, honestly. I mean, I think for the LNG projects that are already well underway, which is, I think, the remainder of LNG projects we will see, I think they'll proceed. And so I think that we're already in a good space to see more LNG on the basis of the momentum which I see today. For any new major piece of infrastructure that needs to go across multiple jurisdictions, whether it's provinces or First Nations and Indigenous communities, I can't say that we can leapfrog. And I've mentioned this before, because there's still things that we need to do on the basis of the communities that we just discussed at the beginning of this time that we need to get right. So if we can be very forward thinking, if we can make sure that we are engaging at the right level in local communities, including Indigenous communities, openly recognizing the opportunity for shared value, recognizing that it will not go as fast as we might want if we're just looking at our watches. But if we can recognize the unique Canadian circumstances, then it's a huge opportunity, not only just to leapfrog to bring more commodities to market, but to actually do something which might not otherwise happen in many Indigenous communities, which is to build economic reconciliation in a way that Canada has never seen before. Now, that would be incredibly powerful, but that won't be easy. But if we can do that, yeah, I think that would be not only an economic leapfrog, I think that would be an incredible leapfrog for all communities, including our Indigenous communities.
Well, I think it's a lovely vision, and I want to thank you both for your judicious blend of optimism and realism. We'll see how this turns out. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it further as the country develops on these questions over the next year or two.
Fantastic. Thanks for the opportunity, Ed.
Well, Andrew, we covered a lot of territory there, didn't we?
We did.
I think we've given a roadmap for the country, but it's important, to figure out in the different age that we're in, what is the appropriate role for government? Because obviously there's a role for government, and what is that role to your thinking?
This is something that I think about all the time. And, by nature, my whole career, I've been a free marketer, right? And I inherently don't really believe that government should be picking winners or losers. I think, and this is not a slight on Canada, but I think it's sort of globally, I think governments have generally not been great at picking winning projects. And I think ultimately, as I said on the podcast, I think for me, the role of government is to put the conditions in place, the rules of the game, set the rules of the game by which companies are going to compete, right? But I also think, and this is the other part of my brain, which is we're at a certain point in time, right, for the issues that we spoke about: energy security, energy affordability, sovereignty, right? Frankly, the future prosperity of this country, where if you're just putting the rules of the game in place and you're defining those rules of competitiveness, like, will those projects naturally emerge, and will they emerge at the pace at which we need them, right? And so I think we're at a certain moment in time where, as much as the free market side of me like doesn't like the idea of picking winners and losers, I think we're kind of at that point where we have to, right? And so I think the question then for me becomes is, okay, well, how do you begin to like tilt the odds in favor that you're going to make the right choices around some of those particular projects? And I think in order to do that requires you to look a little bit in the future, right? Requires government to have a bit of a vision of what you could and want to be able to create, not in the next 2 to 3 years, but in the next couple of decades. And for that, I might almost refer to it as a bit of a bifocal view of the world, right? So and so what are these projects going to be able to do for you short term, or all the short term needs that they're going to be able to address? But what is the long term opportunity that they can potentially capitalize or catalyze?
I think maybe winners and losers might be the old way of looking at it. I think perhaps we need to think about it, and you've described this, already. But I think the way we have to look at it, if we're in a geopolitical age where economic security and national security have fused in many ways, then there's a big societal interest in what we're developing that will give us economic security against forces that are bigger than the market. And so, it's kind of flipped on its head in some ways. It's not just what can the market, what can corporations promote and do. There's also the question, well, what do we need for our physical and economic security? And so the question's a little bit different now, isn't it?
I completely agree, right? And that's why I said, like, we're at a particular moment in time where I think areas like sovereignty, national security are trumping some of those other factors, right? And so, yeah, like, we're at that moment in time where we do need to, maybe you don't call them winners and losers. Maybe you're saying, well, we're going to have to put some bets down on where we think, value is going to be realized, and what are the things that are going to be able to give us the best odds for success in reaching the kind of vision that we want to be able to create.
Okay, well, look, thank you so much for your time, your insights. This is great. This is what you get to do every day, which gives you one of the fun jobs in the country and in Deloitte. And I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Excellent, my pleasure.
Okay, so that was a very rich conversation today. And I thank all of you for listening as well. Canada's energy sector is a global powerhouse in transition. There's the variables that are playing are greater than they've ever been before, and we have to look at it. But, we've just had a great success. It's taken a long time to have this success, but LNG Canada is operating. We are exporting gas. We are also exporting oil off this continent for the first time ever. And, that's growing our economy. Some estimates say that's almost 1% of GDP just by itself, those two projects. And there's more to come. So on Full Circle, the Leapfrog series, and we look forward to you listening. If you like the program, please recommend it to your friends and put out some positive signals as well. Thank you so much for listening.